everyone, and welcome to Age Better, where each week we take a deep dive into all the ways we can feel better, look better, live better, and yep, age better. I'm your host, Barbara Hannah Grufferman. Today we're diving into a topic that resonates with so many of us, the impact of stress on our health, especially during midlife. It's no secret that our bodies and minds undergo significant changes as we get older. And for many, midlife can bring a unique set of challenges and stressors, right? Oh, yeah, right. But how does this stress affect our overall health? More importantly, can understanding and managing it help us to age better? Well, I think so. We're about to find out anyway. To unravel these questions, we have a very special guest joining us, Dr. Jasmeet P, a leading medical expert whose groundbreaking research is shedding new light on the connection between stress, inflammation, and metabolic syndrome. Her insights are not just eye-opening, they're potentially life-changing, especially for those navigating the complexities of midlife. Dr. Hayes' study goes beyond the usual health advice. It delves into how our daily stress, and we have so many, oh my gosh, something we all experience, could be silently shaping our health outcomes. The findings? Well, they're fascinating and they can hold the key to aging better. So whether you're feeling the pressures of everyday life, or simply interested in learning more about maintaining your health as you get older, this episode is definitely for you. Dr. Hayes will not only explain the science behind stress and inflammation, but also provide practical, everyday strategies to manage stress and potentially reduce the risk of metabolic syndrome. Before we get started, here's just a little bit more background info about Dr. Hayes. So impressive. She is an associate professor of psychology at The Ohio State University and director of the Mindset Lab. She is a clinical neuropsychologist who has dedicated her career to advancing our understanding of psychological stress and brain injury and how these conditions relate to risk for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. Dr. Hayes' groundbreaking research has been supported by several entities, including the National Institutes of Health and Ohio State's Chronic Brain Injury Program. Her dedication to advancing her discipline and enhancing patient care has established her as a prominent expert in neuropsychological research and an influential contributor to dialogues on brain health and trauma. I am truly honored to have Dr. Hayes join me today. So everyone, pop in your earbuds and get ready to age better. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Age Better. I'm your host, Barbara Hannah Grufferman, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Jasmeet P, who is an associate professor of cognitive neuroscience at Ohio State University, and she also runs the Mindset Lab there. Now, Dr. Hayes just did some incredible research around midlife and inflammation and stress and its connection to possibly increasing your risk for metabolic syndrome. So we have a lot to talk about, especially that word stress. I really want to get to that word stress and all the things it can do to you. So welcome to Age Better, Dr. Hayes.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we do have a lot to talk about, and this is a really serious topic. And I want to make sure that people, when they hear about your research and they learn more about everything that you've been doing and what the outcome is, and that they take from it, hopefully, some tips about what they can do to mitigate their own personal risk. So let's start with this one key word that I already mentioned, stress. Who in the world today is not stressed? Look what's going on in the world, in our country, in the whole world. Everyone I know is stressed out. Then when you add that layer of what a typical midlife person is experiencing as they're going through midlife with all the changes in their personal lives, possibly maybe aging parents, that whole sandwich generation situation and the physical changes that many of us have been going through and are going through, it is stressful. And we now know that stress can contribute to inflammation in the body, lots of studies on that. But your study shows how that inflammation can increase your risk of developing metabolic syndrome. So I want to know, and I think the audience does too, what made you decide to focus on this, especially as it relates to people in midlife?
Yeah, so what's interesting actually is that my interest in this area stemmed from decades long work I conducted studying military veterans who are suffering from post traumatic stress disorder following their deployment overseas. And so, in studying these veterans, I had noticed the relationship between severely traumatic experiences in the war zone and relationships with metabolic syndrome once the soldiers came back home. And so, sure enough, when we studied these links, our work in military veterans, we saw that traumatic stress, inflammation, and metabolic syndrome were all intricately linked. And this is particularly important because this all ties back to brain health, something that's extremely important to consider as we age. And so from there, I became intrigued to try and understand, what about stress in everyday life, even outside of the military context? Like you just mentioned, everybody has stress. This is a constant thing that we just don't get rid of. This is part of the human experience.
Right.
So, what about walking through life? How do we perceive stress? And if we perceive that we have a lot of stress in our lives, how does that relate to inflammation and metabolic syndrome? And so in our newest work, that's exactly what we studied.
And first, for the audience, I mean, we do on the show talk a bit about metabolic syndrome, especially as it relates to midlife and going through menopause and the like. But please just clarify, what is metabolic syndrome?
Absolutely. Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of symptoms such as high blood sugar, excess body fat around the waist, abnormal cholesterol, that although separately, all of these health indicators are important to consider, but when they occur together, they vastly increase one's risk for things like heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes. And in my own work, we're particularly interested in studying risk for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And so it turns out that metabolic syndrome is a huge risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And I also want to mention that the incidence of Alzheimer's is higher in women. And so it becomes even more important that women consider maintaining metabolic health in midlife. And so changes that happen for women through midlife are extremely important to deal with.
You know, I first discovered this new research of yours and your colleagues by, I get so many medical emails, and that's how I found out about this new research. And I believe this is the first bit of research that really connects the dots between stress and inflammation and insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. Am I right about that?
Well, first, I want to mention that there has been decades of work linking stress to inflammation, inflammation to metabolic syndrome, and stress to metabolic syndrome. Each separate relationship has been discovered, but people sort of just assumed that inflammation was the reason linking stress and metabolic syndrome together. But that actually scientifically wasn't investigated to that point. So what's novel in this study is actually measuring all three and finding the evidence for that link.
It's really just incredible. I was very excited when I read this. But please now, how can stress contribute to inflammation? And then in turn, how can inflammation really contribute to a possible increase in metabolic syndrome? Like, how does that even happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we think what's happening with stress is that it induces a physiological response, which can have a profound impact on physical health. So with chronic stress, you activate something that we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. And that leads to the secretion of a molecule called cortisol. So this hormone, even though it's essential for managing acute stress, it can have negative effects when it's persistently elevated. And so persistently elevated cortisol levels can increase pro-inflammatory cytokines, which not only contribute to systemic inflammation, but also to the development of insulin resistance, which is a key factor in metabolic syndrome. And moreover, stress can exacerbate central adiposity, which is the storage of excess fat around the waist, which itself is a risk factor for metabolic syndrome. And that fat tissue around the waist is not inert. It actually secretes inflammatory substances that can further interfere with insulin signaling and metabolism. So you have this sort of vicious cycle of stress relating to inflammation raising risk for these metabolic factors, and the metabolic factors kind of going back and raising inflammation further.
It's just incredible to me. It really is. And we will get to, because I always like to offer tips on how you can mitigate your risks of what we might be talking about, right? And we will get there. We will get there, everyone. But first, can you maybe just tell us a little bit about your methodology? Like how many people were involved and how did you actually do this, in layman terms?
Right. We looked at a data set from a national longitudinal study. It's one of the largest national studies looking particularly at health in midlife in the United States. And so we had close to 700 participants in midlife in this study. And so we examined perceived stress. We asked people about their stress. And for example, one of the items is, in the past month, how often have you felt stressed or nervous? And then in addition to that, we examined objective measures of inflammation through blood tests. Mm-hmm. And we also measured objective measures of metabolic syndrome using sort of this state-of-the-art approach in which we build a model to look at all of the potential markers of metabolic syndrome, including blood pressure, insulin resistance, cholesterol, BMI or body mass index, waist circumference, and others. And so then we examined separate relationships between stress, inflammation, and metabolic syndrome. And then further, we examined building a model whether inflammation could be an explanatory variable in these relationships between stress and metabolic syndrome.
And turned out that, yes, it was, as it turned out, yes. And so we know that a lot of this is based on lifestyle choices that we make. And that's, again, something I always like to convey to the audience, that not all of this is in your control, but a lot of it is. But genetics also plays a part. What do you think the ratio is in this whole scenario between lifestyle and genetics? Do we know?
I don't think that we know exactly, but what I would like to say when people, and I've heard this a lot, that people will say, oh, they're so healthy, that's their good genes, that sort of sentiment. What I'd like for people to know is that although our genes don't change themselves, the way our genes are expressed can absolutely change through lifestyle factors. So, for example, we know that early life stress, smoking, those kinds of lifestyle factors absolutely changes the way our genes are expressed. I think the take home really is that to some extent, genes, they're there. They account for a little bit of the variance that we think about in terms of metabolic syndrome. But lifestyle factors are so key because not only are they important in and of themselves, but they also change the way our genes are expressed. And so I think when people understand that, they will see the benefit to lifestyle factors.
Even though you do get the genes that you get, you get them from your parents and there you have it. And that's how you start, but that you can kind of, again, use the word mitigate. We can mitigate some of the risks by taking certain steps with our lifestyle decisions and choices.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's this whole field now called epigenetics.
Yes, it's so fascinating.
Yes, exactly. And I think that really drives home the point that some of these lifestyle factors are modifiable. They are things under our control that to a large extent that we can do in our everyday lives.
Yeah. And I find that very, very motivating, inspiring, and exciting. And as you pointed out, more and more research is coming out, which is really good news for all of us. So I think this is a great time to segue into, okay, so let's talk about what can we do to lower our risks for getting the inflammation that could then turn into a greater risk for metabolic syndrome. And that's starting with stress. So in one of the many articles I read about this new research of yours is that you did point out that it's some really like low cost ways of dealing with your stress that you are recommending that people really look at very seriously. Let's talk about that. What can people do to mitigate their risks for stress?
Yeah, such a key question. So there are so many different ways, cost-effective ways that people can manage stress. And what I would suggest is that everyone try different things and figure out what's the best for them. So for some people, engaging in physical activity is one of the best ways to manage stress. So personally speaking, engaging in activity is absolutely vital for me to manage stress. And it doesn't have to be an expensive gym membership. It could be walking around the neighborhood, just increasing your physical activity. Now, for others, it's finding comfort in spirituality, prayers, social networks. All of those things have shown to reduce stress. And, another thing that I'd really like to emphasize is sometimes when people think of stress management techniques, they think of having to take out large chunks of their very busy lives to try and reduce their stress. And it doesn't have to be that way. There's many techniques that you can do along with the tasks that you're doing in everyday life. So, for example, when I say the word mindfulness, people usually think of, going into a dark room, closing your eyes, taking
Right.
time out of your day to do that. It doesn't have to be that way. Mindfulness is really about paying attention to what you're doing in the moment. So you don't have to stop your regular activities. You don't have to just focus on meditation. It could be if you're taking your dog for a walk or you're walking from one room to the next, just being present and mindful. That is really sort of what that's about. Even deep breathing exercises, for example, you can do that while you're sitting at your desk typing or, at work. You're doing something at work, you can always deep breathe. And that's a really effective form of reducing your sympathetic system and having your body kind of reduce that acute stress. So ultimately, like we were talking about, all of us have stress and there's really nothing we can do to prevent the difficult things that happen to us. But what's important is finding what works for you, finding your purpose, and finding meaning in what you're doing in your life, and finding others that can go along the journey with you. I think those are all really important ways to manage stress in your life.
Absolutely. All wonderful, wonderful, doable tips. And I know for me personally, you mentioned first and foremost, moving your body. And there is something which I've talked about a lot. I had some experts on discussing with me, things like exercise snacks, things that you can do, as you pointed out, throughout the day. I know for me, I'm sitting at my desk a lot, recording and writing, and every 20 minutes, I'll take a little break and do some push-ups or some squats or a couple of jumping jacks, certainly to walk my dog. And I'm also a runner, so I do intentional exercise by going out there for a long run, but I'm just talking about throughout the day. And this is also something that's very important to people who Dan Buettner from the whole Blue Zones phenomenon really focuses on. The people who are in those zones around the world, they are living a low stress life, relatively speaking, because they are engaged with others on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
They're constantly moving just as part of their life. And these are all things that really, as you pointed out, contribute to lowering your stress. Now, for me, because I'm a little nuts, I do measure just about everything. I have my Apple Watch, the Ultra on, and I do. And whenever I start to feel like I'm getting a little stressed by whatever, maybe a headline that pops up on my iPad, and I will click on the heart rate. And if I see what it is, and then I will do the breathing. I had a breathing expert onto my show. He's from Ireland. He wrote a best-selling book. He was on the show a couple of months ago. And I'll do my breathing exercise and I will watch my heart rate go down. I've actually videotaped it with my phone as proof that it works. It's so funny, but it does. It does work. And these are really free except for buying the watch, but these are free things that you can do throughout your day. And that's what's, I think, really good news. So what's next for you? What are you going to do with this research and continue with it? Tell us what's going on with you.
Yeah, so first, I'd really like to give a shout out to my wonderful lab and graduate students, Savannah Juergens and Sarah Prieto, who are really driving a lot of the work as well. And so we're doing as a lab is really following these individuals longitudinally to see what kinds of stressors are the ones that people may want to manage the most. So, for example, I have a student who's very interested in looking at discrimination stress. And, as women, we face discrimination. People from underrepresented backgrounds face discrimination. How does discrimination stress impact inflammation, metabolic syndrome? And then also,
that's fascinating.
Yeah, those modifiable factors. What factors are kind of give you the most bang for your buck in reducing metabolic syndrome and reducing risk for Alzheimer's disease? So we actually have several studies ongoing in the lab where we're following people and characterizing them over time to try and figure out the risk and resilience factors.
Oh, really wonderful. So I know you'll be back on the show to talk about your future research. And it's so nice that you mentioned your colleagues, your graduate students. I know they were also referenced in some of the articles that I read about this research, and really applaud to all of you at the Mindset Lab. So, Dr. Hayes, this was really incredible. And I would love to have you come back, as I hope you would like to come back.
Absolutely.
But for now, because we covered a lot, could you just give our audience your top 3, however many you'd like to share, takeaways from our conversation today?
Absolutely. First and foremost, I want people to know that mental health has physiological and biological consequences. So don't ignore it. I think, a lot of times people think, oh, well, it's just in your head. Well, yes, it's in your head, but biologically, it's in your head. It makes a huge impact. So really getting to know yourself, getting to know your mental health states is so important. I think another key takeaway is that our lifestyle choices, and we've talked about this quite a bit, are extremely important in maintaining health through midlife and older adulthood. So, again, I've heard people say, oh, well, that person has good genes. But what I want to impress that what makes the most difference are those lifestyle factors. And then third, what I'd like to kind of have people think about is that it's never too late to enact healthy lifestyle choices. Midlife is a great time for this. Older adulthood is a great time for this, to reduce stress, to eat well, to sleep, get physically active, spend time with people. I think everybody is doing the best that they can given the circumstances that they're in. But can you just make small tweaks to your lifestyle? Like you mentioned, small breaks throughout the day. Doesn't have to be big or dramatic. We know that even those small changes that someone can make can improve our life by a great amount. Yeah, so those are, I think, the key takeaways that we've had through all of our research.
Those are great takeaways. And of course, I agree with all of them. And you said one of my favorite words too, tweak. I'm a big believer, and I urge people to do this all the time, to assess, to reassess where you are, because, we're changing. What's working for me now at 67, I'm different than when I was 50, when I first started really focusing on my health and well-being as I was getting older. So periodically, I'll reassess where I am, what I'm eating, how I'm sleeping, how I'm moving my body, how often, so on and so forth. And then I'll tweak accordingly. And I do that fairly frequently. If I feel something's off, something's not working right, or if my healthcare numbers aren't, my health check numbers aren't where they should be, I tweak. Very often in conjunction and partnership with my healthcare provider too, which is something I also encourage people to reach out to their trusted healthcare provider and have these discussions. Thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate the time. I know how busy you are.
Absolutely. This is such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode of Age Better Podcast, please do a few things. First, share it with all your friends and family. Then, subscribe to Age Better wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, so you never miss a single episode. Finally, if you have ideas for topics you want me to cover in a future episode of Age Better, send an email to agebetterpodcast@gmail.com or reach out to me on social media. Until next time, remember this: we can't control getting older, but we can control how we do it. Talk to you soon. Age Better Podcast is a proud member of the Sound Advice Network. Sound Advice, women's voices amplified.